Alright, let's travel to the moon in Chapter 27, Section 2. In this section, you should be able to know the general characteristics of the moon, explain how the moon formed, identify different features of the moon, know a little bit about the moon's layers, as well as know when the first moon landing was. So if we take a look at the conditions of the moon, there's no liquid water. However, scientists have found very small traces of ice locked in some of the deeper layers of the moon's surface. Temperatures on the moon can range from 123 degrees Celsius or 253 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun, and in the shade, the darker parts of the moon, it can get down to negative 274 degrees Fahrenheit. This happens, and you get this big fluctuation, because there's little atmosphere to trap the heat. So when it's in the sun's light, it's warm. When it's not in that sun's light, it gets really cold. Also note, there is no oxygen in that very little atmosphere. The diameter of the moon is about a quarter of the Earth, so it's a little less than the distance across the United States. And it is the largest moon relative to the size of a planet it orbits. The moon contains about 1/8 of Earth's mass. So taking a look at our neighbor, its composition is very similar to Earth, and its density is also very similar. It is our closest neighbor, and it's about 240,000 miles away, compared to the Sun, which is 93 million miles on average. And the position of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun together are what causes the phases of the moon, eclipses, and tides, which we'll talk about in the next section. So the moon is between 3.8 and 4.6 billion years old, and we know that Earth is around 4.55 billion years old. The moon was heavily bombarded by rocks and space debris in the first 800 million years, but that has slowed down significantly. So this bombardment is what's led to the loose rock on the surface called regolith, as well as is the reason why so many craters exist on the moon today. If we look at the moon's brightness, the term albedo refers to how much light is reflected. A higher albedo means more reflectivity. But the moon actually has a very low albedo, of only about 7% compared to Earth's 31%. So while it appears really bright in our sky, it really only reflects 7% of the light that hits its surface. Its surface is actually very dark. So Galileo first used a telescope, and first made a telescope by putting two lenses in a wooden tube, and this made distant objects appear closer. From this, he was able to study the different features on the moon, including craters, Highlands, Maria, and Rilles. So Highlands are these heavily cratered regions of the moon that are very light in color and mountainous. Maria are the dark and relatively smooth plains, and they're formed by rising lava, so this was back when we had volcanic activity on the moon. And Rilles are valley-like structures, possibly formed from collapsed lava tubes. So all of these features are what make up the man in the moon, if you've ever heard of this. So if we take a look, there's the first eye. The second eye, you have his nose, and then his mouth would be down here. Taking a look at craters, these craters form when giant objects crash into the surface, and material is blasted out in all directions and is called ejecta. Sometimes you'll get these long trails of ejecta that travel out like spokes, and these are called rays. If we jump back to the last slide, you can actually see down here a very prominent example of this. So you can see this ejecta coming out in all directions. So you can see these rays coming out of this crater. The moon does have layers. It has a crust, an upper mantle, a lower mantle, and a core. The upper mantle is solid, since it's had a long time to cool. The lower mantle is possibly somewhat molten, but we're not really sure. And the core is a solid iron. So the moon does actually have occasional earthquakes, or since it's on the moon, we call them moonquakes. However, the moon is not technically tectonically active. And these moonquakes are not very strong either, they're little rumblings. There are no volcanoes or magnetic field currently on the moon that we know of. So if we take a look at how the moon formed, there's been several different ideas to explain its formation. The most accepted is called the impact theory or the collision theory. So this idea is that the moon formed from a Mars-sized object colliding with Earth, and it ejected a bunch of material out into space that stayed there for hundreds of thousands to millions of years, and ultimately started essentially snowballing together and combined, kind of like through the process of coalescence, to form the moon. Again, this process took a really long time to happen, and all of this material stayed out there for a long time until finally it either got pulled back down to Earth because of Earth's gravity or formed together to create the moon. If we look at our first moon landing, this was through the Apollo 11 mission, and they landed on July 20th, 1969. There were 3 astronauts on board: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. And the famous saying that Neil Armstrong said when he was stepping onto the surface was, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And you don't have to write this, but just as general information, there have been 24 astronauts that have traveled to the moon, and of those 24, only 12 have walked on the surface. Apollo 11 was the first landing in July of 1969, then Apollo 12 later in 1969. Apollo 13 was an attempted mission to the moon, but they were never actually successful. Apollo 17 was the last time a man has actually stepped foot on the moon, and Apollo 18 is a fake movie. So from this, you should now know the general characteristics of the moon. You should be able to explain how the moon formed, be able to identify different features of the moon, know about the moon's layers, as well as when our first moon landing was.